I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Temporary policies don't usually feel dangerous. They feel reasonable, measured, responsible. They're introduced during moments of fear, moments when people are willing to trade long-term thinking for short-term relief. But history shows us something unsettling. Temporary policies almost never stay temporary. And when they don't just linger, but quietly reshape the country. So here's the question this video is really about. Why do so many of the systems Americans feel trapped in today trace back to policies that were never meant to last? And more importantly, what actually happens when a government response outlives the crisis that justified it? There's a repeating pattern you see over and over in American history. It looks like this. A crisis emerges, the government intervenes, and the intervention is framed as temporary. But once the crisis fades, the policy stays, not because someone forgot to reevaluate it, but because incentives formed around it, budgets depended on it, and careers have been built on it. Institutions have reorganized themselves around it, and at that point, ending it becomes harder than it was to start it. In August of 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television to address the nation, facing inflation, trade imbalances, and pressure on the dollar. He announced what he called a temporary measure.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
The gold standard had anchored the U.S. currency for decades, and suspending it was supposed to buy time, nothing more. Nixon even reassured Americans, this action will not mean the dollar is devalued. But that temporary suspension was never reversed. Instead, it became the foundation of a new system, a fiat currency managed by central banks untethered from fiscal constraint. And that shift didn't just change money, it changed incentives. Deficits became easier, debt became normal, inflation became systematic instead of exceptional. And once the economy adapted to that reality, going back wasn't an option. We actually have a whole video on this, but the 1971 breaking of the gold standard actually led to the 1973 oil embargo, which reshaped the modern economy and was very influential in leading to the two-income trap, as well as leading to the rise in inflation that we've seen over the past 50 years. And what's important to know is this policy staying permanent wasn't a moral failure, it was a structural one. Because once the system learned that it could operate this way, once governments, markets, and institutions adjusted, reversing it would have caused more damage than maintaining it. So its temporary became permanent because permanence was safer than reform. The same pattern showed up again in the early 1970s. Facing rising crime, social unrest, political instability, Nixon also declared the war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Whether you focus on intent or outcome, the result was the same. A temporary crackdown became a permanent system, with mandatory minimums, federal funding pipelines, and entire law enforcement bureaucracies. The crisis passed, but the infrastructure didn't. Once prisons, police departments, and courts were funded and staffed around the system, dismantling it threatened livelihoods, budgets, and political careers. So instead of asking, is this working, the system began asking, how do we justify continuing? And the temporary policy didn't just stay, it required constant renewal and expansion to survive. Student loans followed the same arc. They were introduced to expand access to education, a short-term solution to a real problem, lack of affordability. But once the government guaranteed the loans, the risk disappeared, and universities no longer had to compete on price. Lenders no longer had to fear defaults, so tuition was able to rise, not accidentally but predictably. And what was meant to help students temporarily became a permanent debt structure, one that couldn't be discharged, one that follows people for decades, and the system adapted and then defended itself. Here's the part that usually goes unspoken. Permanent emergency systems don't just persist, they change how decisions are made. They normalize exceptions. They shift responsibility away from individuals and onto structures. They create environments where failure is managed, not prevented. And over time, people stop asking why the system exists at all. They only argue about how it should be adjusted, what we're left with. So when people today feel like they're living inside systems they never consented to, systems that feel unavoidable, inflexible, and permanent, it's not paranoia, it's history. It's the temporary solutions that were never removed, and they were institutionalized. If this video helped you see these systems differently, please take a look at other videos on this channel where we break down how power, policy, and incentives actually work. Also, please consider leaving a comment with a policy you remember being sold as temporary and never going away. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again on the Hidden Media.